It was a Friday night when the doorbell rang 3 times sharp, deliberate, impossible to ignore. The kind of sound that makes your stomach tighten before your mind can explain why. My name is Cambria Nolan. I'm 35, a financial analyst in Pittsburgh, and that morning I'd finally earned the promotion and raise I'd worked toward for a decade. I thought the knock meant celebration. I was wrong. When I opened the door and saw my parents standing there, I felt it, that familiar shift in the air. Something wasn't right. When I opened the door, my mother was standing there, with a store-bought cake balanced carefully in her hands, the plastic lid already fogging from the cold. My father stood just behind her, holding 2 flimsy paper cups and a bottle of cheap wine, smiling in a way that never quite reached his eyes. "We heard the good news," Mom said brightly, rushing past me before I could even decide whether to invite them in. "Our daughter finally made it." The words sounded proud, but the tone felt measured, calculated, without asking if I wanted any. The air without asking if I wanted any. The air filled with her heavy perfume mixing with the faint scent of coffee I'd left on the counter. It felt less like a celebration and more like a performance everyone had rehearsed, except me. Dad poured the wine into the paper cups and raised his toward me. "To family," he said, tapping his cup lightly against mine. That phrase, "to family." Growing up, it always came before something I was expected to give. Time, money, silence. We exchanged small talk for a few minutes. My promotion, the market, Pittsburgh weather. Mom asked how much the raise was, her voice casual, but her eyes sharp. I told her. I watched the number land between them like a coin hitting a metal table. There it was, the shift. Mom leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together. Dad's smile faded into something heavier. Familiar. The room grew very quiet except for the steady ticking of the wall clock. "You know," she began calmly, "we deserve half. Right after everything we've done for you. Half. Not a loan, not help with a bill, not even framed as support. Just half." For a moment, I honestly wondered if I'd misheard her. The second hand of the clock swept forward. 1, 2, 3. The longest 3 seconds of my life. Dad nodded as if she'd just stated something obvious. "We sacrificed a lot, Cambria. You wouldn't be here without us." There it was, the script I'd heard in different forms for years. Every achievement quietly rewritten as a debt. Every step forward somehow proof that I owed them more. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I stood up slowly and walked to the counter. My hands felt steady, which surprised me. I had prepared for this conversation long before that doorbell rang. Maybe part of me had always known this day would come. I picked up the envelope that had been sitting there since the afternoon, plain white, sealed. When I returned to the table, they both watched me, expectant, confident, certain this was the part where I would apologize for hesitating. I placed the envelope gently in front of them. Dad frowned slightly, then tore it open. Mom leaned in. Their expressions changed almost immediately. Confidence drained into confusion. The color in Mom's cheeks faded. Dad's jaw tightened as his eyes moved across the page. No one spoke. The ticking clock felt louder now. Inside that envelope wasn't a check. It wasn't a promise. It was a document, a declaration. The boundaries I had quietly put into writing long ago, proof that my income, my future, My earnings were legally and financially independent from them. No shared accounts, no obligations, no claims. Everything they needed to understand. I took a slow breath and finally met their eyes. "That's everything you need," I said softly. Not angry, not defensive, just clear. Mom's lips parted as if she was about to argue, but nothing came out. Dad looked down at the paper again as if hoping it would change. I didn't wait for the explosion, or the guilt, or the tears. I turned and walked away, leaving them sitting at my kitchen table, cake half-cut wine, untouched, the illusion of control slipping quietly out of their hands. And for the first time in my life, I let the silence do the talking. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first, I thought it was work. A flood of emails, maybe a follow-up about the promotion. But when I rolled over and reached for the screen, the brightness felt almost violent against my eyes. 53 notifications, most of them from Facebook. I opened the first one and my chest tightened. My mother had written a long post overnight. It started with an old photo of me at 17, braces graduation gown arms around both of them. We looked happy. We looked like a family people would admire. The caption began gently. "Some children forget who raised them once they start earning money." By the third paragraph, the tone shifted. Sacrifice, ingratitude, disrespect. It ended with a line that felt engineered to wound. "No parent deserves to be treated this way." She never mentioned the envelope, never mentioned the demand for half my raise. Just a carefully curated story where she was the grieving mother and I was the cold, selfish daughter. Within hours, the post had been shared across neighborhood groups in Pittsburgh. People I hadn't spoken to in 15 years were commenting. I always knew she thought she was better than everyone. So sad what money does to people. Your own town turning into a jury, and you're not even in the room. Her friends flooded the comments with heart emojis and prayers, calling her strong, calling her brave. One woman wrote, "You raised her better than this," as if I'd failed some moral exam I didn't know I was taking. I kept scrolling even though I shouldn't have. Each comment felt like a small stone being placed on my chest. By the time I got to the office, I could already feel it. Something in the air had changed. Conversations dipped slightly when I walked past. Not completely silent, just softer. Curious glances that lingered half a second too long. You know that look people give when they've heard something about you but aren't sure if they're allowed to ask? That was the look. At lunch, an email popped up from HR asking if I could step in for a quick chat. Quick chat. Those two words have never meant anything good. The blinds in her office were half closed. She offered me a polite smile and gestured for me to sit. "Cambria," she began gently, folding her hands on the desk. "I don't want to pry, but is everything okay at home?" It sounded kind. It probably was meant to be kind, but underneath it was something else. The knowledge that my private life had become office conversation. I nodded. "Yes, everything's fine." The lie tasted metallic in my mouth. She studied my face for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded back. "If you need anything, let us know." I left her office with my stomach churning. Not because I was ashamed, but because I realized how quickly control can expand once it goes public. My parents hadn't just attacked me emotionally. They had dragged my reputation into it. Back at my desk, my phone lit up again. Dad, his texts were always long, paragraphs, carefully structured lectures disguised as concern. After all we've done for you, this is how you repay your parents. Loyalty matters, Cambria. Each sentence layered with guilt. Each word pressing on the same nerve. He wrote about sleepless nights when I was a baby, about school tuition, about sacrifices I supposedly couldn't understand. Then the last line, "You'll regret this." I stared at it for a long time. Regret what? Setting a boundary, refusing to be split in half financially. Anger tried to rise, but it didn't quite make it. What I felt instead was exhaustion. The kind that settles behind your eyes and makes everything look slightly blurred. Late that afternoon, a message came from a neighbor I barely knew. It was a photo. My mother was standing outside my apartment building, tissue in hand, mascara streaked just enough to look tragic. Someone across the street was recording her on their phone. The caption under the photo read, "She's here crying because her daughter won't even talk to her." I could almost hear her voice without sound, the trembling tone, the rehearsed breaks in her speech. She had turned pain into performance, and the internet was her stage. I put my phone face down on my desk and just sat there. The office hummed around me, keyboards clicking distant laughter from the break room. But it all felt far away, like I was watching my own life through glass. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It had become a spectacle. My parents weren't just asking for money. They were building a narrative, one where I was ungrateful, one where they were victims, one that made it easier to pressure me into giving in. Because how do you defend yourself against a story that's already been believed? By the time I got home that evening, the sky had turned a dull blue. My apartment felt smaller than usual, like the walls had absorbed the noise from outside. The cake from the night before was still on the counter untouched. I stood there for a long moment staring at it. Yesterday they had come through my door smiling. Today they had taken my private boundary and turned it into public theater. And I realized something that unsettled me more than the gossip. They weren't embarrassed. They were escalating. That evening when my phone rang again, I braced myself. I expected another message from my father, another paragraph about loyalty, another warning about regret. My chest was already tight when I answered, but the voice on the other end was softer, older, steady. "Cambria," my grandmother Eleanor Nolan said gently. The tension in my shoulders eased just a little. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't mention the Facebook post or the video outside my building. Somehow, she always seemed to know when explanations would only make things heavier. "Let them talk," she said after a pause. "The truth will outlive the noise." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was something grounded in it. Something that felt older than the chaos swirling around me. I closed my eyes and leaned against the kitchen counter. "It doesn't feel that way right now." "I know," she replied, "but noise burns fast. Truth is patient." She didn't defend my parents. She didn't defend me either. She simply offered something solid to stand on. Silence. Not the weak kind, the deliberate kind. After we hung up, I sat in my living room for a long time. The apartment felt both too quiet and too alive, humming with the distant sounds of the city. I kept replaying her words in my mind. Truth is patient. 2 weeks later, I drove to Harrisburg to see her. Her house sat at the edge of town, small and white, with a porch that creaked in familiar places. She was already waiting by the door when I pulled into the driveway wrapped in her thick gray cardigan despite the mild weather. She always wore that sweater when something serious was on her mind. Inside, the kitchen smelled like chamomile tea and lemon bread. She poured me a cup before I even took off my coat. Her movements were calm, unhurried, as if she had been expecting this visit long before I called. I hadn't come to talk about Facebook. The night before, I had found a white envelope slipped under my apartment door. No return address, just my name typed neatly across the front. I reached into my bag and placed it on her kitchen table. The seal read Dauphin County Court. Even saying those words out loud had felt unreal. She adjusted her glasses and unfolded the document slowly, her eyes scanning each line. The room felt smaller with every second that passed. "It's a petition," I said quietly. They filed it. Her lips pressed into a thin line. When she finished reading, she didn't look surprised. That unsettled me more than anything. "I received one too," she said. My head snapped up. "You did." She reached for a second envelope on the counter. It was already creased, as if she had opened and closed it several times. "They've asked me to testify." "For them?" She nodded. The words in my document echoed in my mind. Parental support petition. I had never heard the term before. It sounded almost clinical, polite, but the meaning was brutal. "They're suing me," I whispered. "For financial support," Grandma said gently. "They're claiming you owe them assistance for their care." The air left my lungs slowly, like something inside me had been punctured. Suing, not arguing, not guilt-tripping, not posting online. Suing. I stared at the paper again, trying to reconcile the formal language with the faces I knew. My parents' names were printed in bold, detached, and official, as if they were strangers filing a complaint against a company, not their daughter. A wave of disbelief washed over me first. Then, something colder. A quiet understanding that this had never been about celebration. It had always been about control. Grandma reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was warm, steady. "You need legal help," she said. Immediately. I nodded, but my thoughts were still tangled. "I can't believe they would actually take this to court. They believe they're entitled," she replied. There was no anger in her voice, just clarity. I swallowed. "If this goes public, it already is," she interrupted softly. "That's why you must be careful now." She leaned back slightly, studying me in that way she always had, like she was measuring not my fear, but my strength. "Don't fight them with anger," she said. "That's what they'll expect. Anger makes you look unstable. It makes you reactive." Her fingers squeezed mine gently. "Fight them with reason." The words settled into me more deeply than anything else had in weeks. Reason. Documentation, facts, calm. Not Facebook posts, not emotional replies, not shouting back into the noise. "They want you to lose your composure," she continued, "because then they can say, 'See, she's unreasonable.'" A slow realization began to form. This wasn't just a family conflict anymore. It was strategy, and if I reacted the way they hoped, I would be walking straight into it. I looked down at the petition again. The official language, the deadline for response, the threat of a court summons if I failed to appear. For a moment, I felt 18 again. Small, outnumbered, waiting to be told what I owed. But I wasn't 18. I was 35, financially independent, employed, stable. "They can't just decide I owe them half my life," I said quietly. Grandma's eyes softened. "No," she replied. "They can't. But you'll have to prove it." The tea between us had gone lukewarm, untouched. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its tires humming against the pavement. Everything looked normal, ordinary, as if no legal war had just been declared inside that small kitchen. I folded the court notice carefully and slid it back into the envelope. For the first time since this began, I wasn't thinking about defending my reputation. I was thinking about building a case, and I knew exactly who I needed to call next. I called Grace Turner that same night. We hadn't seen each other in months, but some friendships don't need maintenance. They just wait. When I told her it was urgent, she didn't hesitate. We met at a small coffee shop near downtown Harrisburg, the kind with exposed brick walls and dim lighting that makes every conversation feel more serious than it already is. Grace arrived straight from work, her blazer still crisp, her expression already focused. She didn't waste time on small talk. "Let me see it." I handed her the court documents. She read in silence, one page after another, her brow tightening slightly, but never dramatically. Grace didn't react emotionally to things. She dissected them. After a few minutes, she looked up. "They're using an old state law," she said. "It allows parents to request financial support from adult children if they can prove they're indigent." I blinked. "That's real." "It's rare," she replied. "Outdated, but technically still enforceable." The word "technically" sat heavily between us. "So they could win?" I asked. She exhaled softly. "If they prove financial hardship and demonstrate that you have the ability to pay, yes. But courts are skeptical of these cases, especially if there's manipulation involved." Manipulation. We both knew that word wasn't strong enough. Grace tapped the page with her finger. "The bigger issue isn't just the money, it's optics." I felt my stomach tighten. "My job," she nodded. "If this becomes public, and it might, people won't dig into nuance. They'll see daughter refuses to support parents and make assumptions. Employers don't always read between the lines." I stared down at the table, watching my reflection ripple faintly in my untouched coffee. "So this isn't about survival for them," I said slowly. "It's about control." Grace met my eyes. People who feel entitled don't handle rejection well. When they lose influence privately, they try publicly. The word control echoed in my mind long after she said it. A few days later, another envelope arrived with the official summons. Court date set. 2 weeks away. Inside was a packet labeled evidence submitted by petitioners. My hands were steady when I opened it. They weren't steady after. Screenshots of text messages supposedly from me promising monthly financial support. The tone affectionate, cooperative, the dates recent. But I had never written them. The number attached to the messages was nearly identical to mine, off by a single digit. I drove straight to Grace's office the next morning. She paced as she read through the pages, her jaw tightening. "They fabricated this," she said flatly. "This isn't emotional manipulation anymore. It's fraud." The word hit differently. Fraud meant consequences. It meant lines had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Grace immediately shifted into strategy mode. "I need your full message history with them," she said. "Call logs, emails, everything." By that afternoon, my inbox was flooded not with accusations this time, but with my own records. I requested detailed phone carrier logs to prove the fake number wasn't registered to me. I pulled 5 years of payroll statements, bank records, tax filings, every document that demonstrated independence. Each file printed, highlighted, organized. Grace assembled it into a growing binder labeled Defense. "They want to paint you as someone who abandoned them," she said, while flipping through the pages. "So we'll show you've been financially independent since 18. Self-sufficient, transparent." The process was exhausting, but something unexpected happened as the binder grew thicker. I stopped feeling hunted. I started feeling prepared. "That weekend, Grandma called. I wrote a statement," she said, quietly. "They asked for my testimony, so I gave them the truth." She told the court I'd left home at 18, paid my own tuition, never asked for help, never relied on them financially. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. Just facts. Her voice trembled slightly as she described mailing it. "I won't lie for them," she said. "Not even for my own son." I swallowed hard. "Thank you." 2 days later, another message arrived. This one wasn't from a family member. The subject line read, "Last chance." The email was short. "Pay up or we'll ruin you." No signature, no identifiable address, just the threat. For a split second, my pulse raced. The old fear flickered. What if they actually could ruin me? What if the gossip grew? What if my company decided I was too much risk? But the fear didn't last long. I took a screenshot, attached it to an email, forwarded it to Grace with a single line. "Add this to the file." That night, my living room looked less like a home and more like a war room. Papers spread across the floor, color-coded tabs marking sections, highlighter streaks across bank statements and phone logs. Outside rain tapped steadily against the windows. Inside, something had shifted. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was building. Each document felt like a brick. Each fact a layer of armor. Grace moved with sharp precision, cross-referencing dates, flagging inconsistencies in their claims, outlining questions she would ask in court. "They're escalating because they think you'll break," she told me. "I won't," I said. And for the first time, I meant it, without forcing the words. By the time I closed the binder, Defense Cambria Nolan, the anxiety that had once felt suffocating had transformed into something steadier. Resolve. The court date circled on my calendar no longer looked like a threat. It looked like a deadline. 2 weeks. 2 weeks until everything they'd tried to do in whispers, in posts and fabricated screenshots would have to stand in front of a judge. And for the first time since the doorbell rang on that Friday night, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was ready to speak. The courthouse smelled like paper and nerves. That was the first thing I noticed when I stepped inside. A faint mix of floor polish, old files, and something heavier anticipation maybe. The kind that lingers in hallways where lives quietly change. I sat at the defendant's table beside Grace, my palms pressed flat against the cool wood to steady myself. The courtroom wasn't packed, but it wasn't empty either. A few local reporters had slipped into the back row whispering to each other. A camera lens shifted slightly in our direction. Across the aisle, my parents sat together. They looked smaller than I remembered, but their presence still filled the room. When the bailiff called the session to order, everyone rose. The judge entered a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes, the kind that suggested he had seen too many versions of the same family story. He nodded once and took his seat. This hearing concerns the petition for parental financial support, filed by Howard and Linda Nolan against their daughter, Cambria Nolan. Hearing my name spoken that way, clinical detached, made my stomach tighten. My mother was the first to speak. She stood slowly, tissue already in hand. Her voice trembled in a way that would have convinced anyone who didn't know her. "Your Honor," she began, "we did everything for her. We supported her education, her dreams, her life." Her breath caught mid-sentence. "And when we needed her most, she abandoned us." My father placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his expression carved carefully into grief. From the gallery, I heard a faint murmur. It was almost impressive, the consistency of the performance. The same narrative from Facebook, now wrapped in legal language. When it was Grace's turn, she stood without hurry. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "my client has been financially independent since the age of 18. The petitioners are not destitute, nor are they unsupported." She moved toward the bench and handed up a folder. Records show that the petitioners own 2 properties in Allegheny County. One of those properties is currently rented, generating recurring income. The judge adjusted his glasses and scanned the documents. Additionally, Grace continued, both petitioners receive social benefits and retirement payments. The claim of financial hardship is unsupported by their own bank statements. The air shifted. My mother's composure faltered for just a second. The judge looked directly at my parents. "Do you have documentation proving financial distress?" Mom hesitated before sliding forward a folder. Grace stepped closer to review it. "These statements confirm rental deposits," Grace said calmly. "Consistent monthly income." Silence settled heavily across the room. Then the clerk called the next witness. The courtroom doors opened, and my grandmother walked in, slowly leaning on her wooden cane. Every sound seemed to fade as she made her way to the stand. She took the oath without wavering. "I love my son," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the judge. "And I love my daughter-in-law, but truth matters more than comfort." The words didn't shake, they landed. She has supported herself since she left home at 18. She paid for her own college. She never once depended on them financially. Grandma's grip tightened slightly on the edge of the stand. If anything, they have relied on her. A visible flush crept up my mother's neck. Grandma didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply told the truth, plain and steady. Grace approached once more. "Your Honor," she said, handing up one final document. "This is a notarized declaration of financial independence signed by both parties 3 years ago." The paper looked almost ordinary, a single sheet, but I knew it well. It had been inside the envelope I'd placed on the kitchen table the night they demanded half my raise. The document stated clearly that I held no ongoing financial obligation to my parents. It had been drafted at their request years earlier when my income first increased specifically to protect my earnings from any shared claims. They had signed it. The judge read it carefully, then looked up. "In light of this declaration, the court finds the petition not only baseless, but deceptive." The word echoed in the stillness. "Furthermore," he continued, "the petitioners will be fined for presenting falsified evidence to this court." My pulse pounded in my ears. The fabricated text messages, the nearly identical phone number, the attempt to manufacture proof. It had crossed from manipulation into fraud. The gavel struck once, firm, final. The sound didn't feel loud. It felt definitive. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled quickly. Someone in the back shifted in their seat. I turned slowly toward my parents. My mother's face had changed. The tearful expression was gone. In its place was something colder, anger, stripped of pretense. My father avoided my eyes entirely. For a moment, I felt something rise inside me. Not triumph, not revenge, release. The weight I had carried since that Friday night, the buzzing phone, the public humiliation, the threats, began to loosen its grip. Grace gathered our papers with quiet efficiency. Across the aisle, Grandma gave me the smallest nod, calm, proud, tired. When we stepped outside the courthouse, the spring air hit my face like sunlight after weeks of gray. It wasn't dramatic. There was no applause, no cinematic music swelling in the background. Just air, fresh and cool. I stood there for a second longer than necessary. That first envelope, the one they opened at my kitchen table months ago, had never been about defiance. It had been about clarity, a boundary written down, a quiet line drawn long before they tried to erase it. They had demanded half of my raise. What I gave them instead was the truth. And as I walked down the courthouse steps into the soft Pennsylvania sunlight, I realized something simple. Freedom doesn't always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it arrives with a single sheet of paper and the courage to stand behind it. By the following week, the story had outgrown the courtroom. In Pittsburgh, news traveled the way it always had, through whispers at coffee shops, folded newspapers on diner counters, and Sunday bulletins passed hand to hand. But this time, it carried a headline. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette ran it across the metro section in restrained but unmistakable type. Local couple fined for filing false parental support claim against daughter. There was no dramatic language, no moral commentary, just facts. The dismissed petition, the falsified evidence, the court's finding of concealed rental income. It didn't need embellishment. By Monday morning, copies of the paper sat open in break room and reception areas. At Cambria's office, the atmosphere felt different, but not hostile. Softer, cautious. A few coworkers approached her quietly. "I'm sorry you went through that," one said, not prying. "I had no idea," another admitted, eyes apologetic. HR sent a short internal note clarifying that the matter was personal resolved and had no bearing on her professional standing. The subtle cloud that had hovered since her parents' Facebook spectacle finally lifted. No more sideways glances, no more awkward silences when she entered the kitchen. Grace, meanwhile, found her inbox fuller than usual. A legal column in the Pennsylvania Bar Association newsletter requested permission to feature the case, not by name, but as an example of ethical defense against abuse of filial responsibility statutes. Within weeks, she was nominated for recognition in their annual publication. She shrugged it off when she told Cambria. "It's not about me," Grace said. "It's about making sure people know the law cuts both ways." But it meant something. The quiet validation that truth, when handled with precision instead of fury, could hold its own. For Cambria's parents, the consequences were less dignified. Church gossip in their congregation shifted from sympathy to scrutiny. People who had once murmured about ungrateful children now whispered about property records and rental units. Invitations grew sparse. Conversations shortened. The fine imposed by the court was manageable, but the exposure was not. With their rental income examined publicly and legal costs mounting, the illusion of financial fragility evaporated. Within months, a real estate sign appeared in front of their house. It went up quietly. No Facebook post this time, no performative tears on sidewalks. Just a listing. Cambria drove past once by accident. At least she told herself it was accidental. The lawn looked smaller than she remembered. The house, less imposing. For years, it had felt like a fortress of authority, the place where expectations were handed down like commandments. Now it was just a structure with a price tag. She didn't stop. On a cool afternoon in early spring, she walked along the river downtown, the Allegheny rolling past in steady, indifferent motion. The trees were beginning to green, soft buds breaking through branches that had seemed dead all winter. She paused at the railing. Victory wasn't the word for what she felt. There was no surge of triumph, no satisfaction in their discomfort, no rehearsed speech in her mind about justice served. What she felt instead was lighter, quieter. The weight of being misrepresented had lifted. The constant bracing for accusation had dissolved into something steadier, an understanding that she had defended herself without becoming cruel. She thought of the envelope she had once placed on their kitchen counter, the one containing a final check and a notarized declaration of financial independence. At the time, it had been a boundary, a line drawn with trembling hands. Now it felt like a beginning. The river moved forward without hesitation. It did not circle back. It did not argue with its banks. Cambria exhaled slowly. She could not control what her parents told others next. She could not erase what had already been said. But she had answered it, not with spectacle, not with revenge, but with facts. And facts had been enough. She turned from the railing and continued walking, hands tucked into her coat pockets, the city humming around her. Not triumphant, not bitter, just free. Cambria signed the lease on a third-floor walk-up in Pittsburgh in late autumn, when the air carried that metallic edge before winter settles in for good. The apartment wasn't large, but it was hers, in a way nothing had ever been before. No shared history in the walls, no inherited expectations pressed into the floors. She painted the living room a muted green, bought mismatched chairs because she liked them, not because they matched anyone else's idea of proper. Hung framed prints she'd kept boxed for years, quiet landscapes, abstract swirls of color that felt like breath on canvas. There were no family photos on display. The silence inside the space didn't feel lonely. It felt deliberate. On her birthday, a card arrived from Harrisburg, written in Grandma Eleanor Nolan's steady slanted handwriting. The return address alone made Cambria smile. She carried it to the kitchen table before opening it careful as if it were something fragile. Inside was a pressed sprig of lavender and a note. Freedom isn't loud, it's consistent. Keep choosing it. No commentary about the case. No mention of her parents. Just pride clear and unadorned. Cambria placed the card on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a small brass star. It stayed there for months. In early December, another envelope appeared. This one thicker. Familiar looping script across the front. Her mother. Cambria didn't open it right away. She set it on the counter and made tea instead, watching steam rise in thin spirals. Outside, the first real snowfall of the season began flakes, drifting past the window in slow, uncertain arcs. Eventually, she slit the envelope open. The letter was careful, almost tender in tone. It spoke of misunderstandings, of how painful the public scrutiny had been, of how a mother's heart never stops hurting. It mentioned the house being sold, the difficulty of starting over. It did not mention the falsified evidence. It did not mention the lawsuit. Near the end, the ask appeared softened in language, but unmistakable. Perhaps we can find a way to support one another again. Cambria read it twice. The old reflex stirred the instinct to explain, to defend, to negotiate, to prove she was not cruel. Instead, she folded the letter along its original crease and placed it back inside the envelope. She didn't respond. Silence, she had learned, was not cruelty. It was clarity. The court record remained what it was dismissed with prejudice. Permanently closed. No avenue for refiling. No shadow waiting to reemerge. She had confirmed it with Grace one final time weeks earlier. Just to be certain. It's over, Grace had said. Legally and procedurally. That night, Cambria cooked a simple dinner: roasted vegetables, rice, a small piece of salmon. She ate at her own table, candlelit snow thickening outside until the city softened under white. The world beyond her windows grew quiet. No raised voices, no accusations, no performances, just the faint hum of the radiator and the muted glow of streetlights, reflecting off fresh snow. Freedom, she realized, did not arrive with applause or headlines. It arrived like this quiet dinner's steady breath, the choice not to answer. Outside, Pittsburgh disappeared gently beneath winter's hush, and inside her small apartment built entirely on her own terms, Cambria felt something settle into place, not triumph, not defiance, peace. Soft and unmistakable, Grandma Eleanor Nolan passed the way she had lived without spectacle. It was early spring again in Harrisburg when the call came. Peaceful, the nurse said, in her sleep. No struggle, no drawn-out goodbye. The funeral was small, a modest service at her church, folding chairs half filled with neighbors who remembered her. Steadiness more than any grand gestures. Cambria stood at the front and spoke briefly. Not about the lawsuit, not about conflict, but about consistency. About a woman who never raised her voice, yet never wavered. Afterward, the attorney handed Cambria a sealed envelope in her grandmother's careful handwriting. Inside was a short letter. Love is not a transaction, it read. If someone requires payment to offer it, what they are offering is not love. Protect your peace without apology. Boundaries are not punishments, they are truth spoken quietly. Grandma left her the house in Harrisburg. It was tidy, sunlit, filled with decades of ordinary tenderness. Cambria kept it for a season long enough to sort photographs, donate clothing, sit at the kitchen table, where so many steady conversations had unfolded. Then she sold it. The proceeds didn't go towards something grand. Instead, Cambria donated the majority to a foundation in Pittsburgh that supports women rebuilding their lives after financial abuse. Women disentangling themselves from debts, coercion, and control disguised as obligation. It felt aligned, clean. The original envelope she had once handed her parents, the one declaring her independence, remained tucked in her desk drawer. Over time, it stopped representing confrontation. It became a symbol of clarity, of the moment she chose truth over appeasement. Cambria's life grew quieter after that, smaller in scale, richer in intention. She was no longer angry, no longer rehearsing arguments in her head. Walking away, she understood now, had never been cruelty. It had been understanding the difference between love and leverage, and choosing the former, even if she had to give it to herself. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose peace over permission. Boundaries aren't walls, they're clarity. And real love doesn't demand proof in the form of sacrifice. If this story resonated with you, I'd truly like to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments. And if you value stories about courage, truth, and quiet strength, consider liking and subscribing so we can keep exploring them together.